My father's parents, my Mosier grandparents, lived out their years in Grinnell, Iowa, in a place appropriately called the Mayflower Home. They lived to be quite old. My grandmother lived to be 88. She died in 1972. Granddad Mosier lived to be 99.9. He was a great statistician. He would have loved to live to be 100. He was starting to plan his birthday celebration that would be on April 12th of 1982. But sometime in late February or early March, he died, 6 weeks shy of his 100th birthday. Anyway, when they were both still alive, Grandmother Mosier, Elva Mosier, might have been around 85, 86, they decided to disperse some of their savings in a sort of early inheritance to us grandchildren, giving us $500 apiece, which was quite a bit of money back in, when would this have been? 1970 or so. So that was a surprise when that money came in the mail. There was no real comment with the check, except hoping that we would enjoy spending the money and would spend it on something useful. But after Grandmother Mosier died, and Granddad was on his own, and he was by then around 90, he didn't know he was going to live another 10 years, nearly. He decided, a year after she died, to send us another installment, a larger one this time, $1,000 apiece. So sometime in the summer of 1973, I got a check for $1,000 with one proviso. Granddad requested, he couldn't force us to, but he requested that each of us write to him or call him and tell him what we were using our $1,000 for. He liked the idea of visualizing what we were spending the money on. I was 24 years old, 1 year out of college, and this $1,000 came at a perfect time. I was going with my $1,000 to build a shack in the woods. I had 80 acres of woods already that I'd bought on my own some 3 or 4 years earlier. I've talked about that elsewhere. I hadn't done anything with it. I hadn't had the money to do anything on it, to build anything. Hadn't had the time or the inclination. But now here was this $1,000. I figured that would be plenty to build a cabin with. I was living on a communal farm outside Menominee, Wisconsin. It was called the Bubbling Springs Farm. There were a dozen of us living there. Most of the people were from 2 families. The Frame family, Mary Ellen and Mike Frame, brother and sister, Mary Ellen's kids. And then there were the Bacons. Dottie Bacon with her children. Dottie was divorced from Geronimo by then. Her brother Jim and his 2 daughters and his wife Jane were living there. We were all working on building a big stone and brick house, which would also be a communal house, shared house this was to be, on a hillside facing down toward the pond in the distance. And way off in the distance was the spring that Bubbling Springs was named for. Up in a further level, back beyond where you couldn't see from the building site, was the pasture where the cows were kept, from which the milk was made, and the milk was put in the spring to keep it cool. It's an idyllic, bucolic setting. A few days after I got this check from Granddad Mosier, I was riding around in Jim Bacon's car with him. And we passed a farm parked out in front of the farm on the road was an old Chevy pickup truck. And daubed on the windshield of the pickup truck, for sale, $100. I knocked on the door. Farm wife answered. She said, "It's for sale, all right. It runs fine. Doesn't always stop great, but it runs fine." Jim nodded, said he could fix the brakes, which he did after I bought it. It was an old dingy green color, of which I did not approve. It was rusted out at the corners. It had burlap sticking through the holes in the rust spots in the corners of the cab. I wanted it red, so I got a can of red automotive paint, or the equivalent, and a barn brush, and I brushed the cab of this truck bright red. Had streaks from the paintbrush. Was not a fancy automotive treatment of the paint job, but I didn't care. It was fine. I had a red truck. Jim had fixed the brakes for $15 or $20, and I was all set. I borrowed some camping equipment, a tent big enough to stand up in, ancient tent. It had a sort of a tree kind of thing in the middle, nice size tent, and it was going to have to be. It'd be my home while I was building my cabin. I hauled all this stuff up to Upper Michigan in my red truck. I had thought at first that I was going to build a log cabin. That seemed most rustic, and it seemed to me the most like what pioneers would have had to do back in the old days. My grandfather himself, Granddad Mosher, Martin Luther Mosher, had been close to a pioneer. They'd been 1 or 2 generations removed from the Conestoga wagon pioneers. He'd grown up in eastern Iowa on a farm. He said later that he had left his home county overnight only once by the time he had turned 19. So his entire childhood was spent in the neighborhood of West Liberty, which was between Muscatine and Iowa City in Muscatine County, eastern Iowa. It had all been compiled in what Granddad called his blue book, the record of who was born where, who died where, very bare bones record of the 4 branches of the Mosher family. Later on, after grandmother died, I think 1978, Granddad, he was 96 years old, and at that point, he completed his brown book of his growing up in eastern Iowa. Very interesting, but I was just on my way out of the country when I got this in the mail, and didn't read any of it until years later, much to my distress now, looking back on it, because Granddad was very much alive, and with it, I could have gone down to the Mayflower home from Minnesota, where I'd been living, working on the railroad. I could have driven down there and had a long chat with him about all these various stories. But as it happened, I wouldn't read them until years later when he was long gone. So I found myself up in Michigan. I had this tent in the woods. I decided I would build my cabin on this saddle sort of spot in this raised area of a granite rock that was 50 or 100 feet higher than the countryside around, but just over the crest of that hill. It had trees on it. It had maple trees, and there were quite a few standing dead cherry trees, which would make wonderful firewood later on. But I lived in my tent. I had a little cot that I'd borrowed, rolled my sleeping bag out on it. One problem, though, was I had no way to clean up, to bathe, after a long day's work of starting my cabin. I needed some swimming trunks or something so I could go to a nearby lake. Lake Gogebic was one possibility, not Gogebic, like it looked on the map. Gogebic, it was pronounced, I found to my embarrassment. First time I called it Lake Gogebic. So I could go to Lake Gogebic and swim, and then I could wash my hair and my armpits and the rest. I drove into the nearest town, Wakefield, which was about 8 miles from my isolated plot of land. I asked around at the Super America or whatever the convenience store on the highway was. They said, no, we don't have anything like that. But go ask Tippy Novak at Tippy's. store, Novak's clothing store. He never gets any customers anyway. It's over on the other side of town. It's in the residential area. They told me how to get there. So I drove the old red truck to that store, found it, and there was a little man behind the counter, standing there with his arms crossed as if he were cold, even though it was August, the summertime, but his store was very dim. He didn't have it well lit. He was rocking back and forth on his heels like he was a cop on the beat, like he'd been standing there for a long time. He said, "Finally a customer. You're my first customer of the day." Very young voice. He was a little man with wispy blonde hair and a quite cheerful demeanor, even though he had no business. He was going broke. Swimming trunks. Well, I think I've got a very old pair of swimming trunks here somewhere. You can have them for free. I said, "I'd rather pay if you don't mind. This is a store. I'll pay you for them." He rummaged around. He found this pair of kind of elastic swimming trunks of a style maybe 3 or 4 waves back in time, from the 1950s possibly. I had no idea. I said, "I'll take them. How much are they?" He said, "Oh," it says $3 on the tag. "You can have them for $1. How about 2, I said. And so began my life of interacting with Tippy Novak, the merchant, where we would bargain in reverse, and I would insist on paying him more than he asked for because he asked for practically nothing. Later on, he would give me a beautiful Woolrich hunting coat when deer season approached. Bright red, the old style, not this flash orange business. Bright red, beautiful material. And I had to talk him up for that too, but that's another story. So I got these swimming trunks, and we're standing there gassing about this and that. He's telling me how much snow there's going to be this winter because there's a lot of snow every winter in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and especially a lot in that section, the Copper Peninsula and around Gogebic County, a lot of snow. The average was 240 inches a year, average of snow, 20 feet of snow. Our area lay between Lake Superior above and Lake Michigan down below and off to the east. So I had my swimming trunks, and as I was about to leave, he said, "It's going to get cold up here pretty soon. Next month, maybe. We've had freezes in September before. October, it'll be snowing. You're going to want a warm place to sleep. Sleeping in a tent won't work for you anymore. You could come sleep here in the back of my store. I've got a spare room back there. There's a toilet and a sink, and if you need a shower, you can come clean up at my house." This was a man I had known for maybe 45 minutes. I bought one article of clothing from him, and already he's so generous. He's offering me to sleep in the back of his store. For free. He never mentioned rent, anything like that. And later on, I would sleep in the back of his store. But for the time being, I was going to tough it out in my tent. I thanked him. I wasn't sure how serious he was. He seemed pretty serious. We got on to politics a little bit, and we couldn't have been more diametrically opposed politically. Turned out the high point of his life, or one of them, had been in 1968 when George Wallace, the segregationist, was coming to campaign in the upper Midwest, and he spoke in Duluth, Minnesota, which was 100 miles from Wakefield. Tippy had driven all that way to hear George Wallace speak, his hero. We got to be great friends. We would argue politics up and down and sideways. Now, one reason I couldn't bathe at my place, where I was starting to work on the foundation, so-called, of my cabin, was that there was no water on the building site. None. No water. I carried in gallon jugs, plastic jugs, that I filled at a spring along the highway between Wakefield and my cabin site. And my plan was to built the pillars for my cabin of rocks that I pried loose from the ground. I had borrowed some tools from the farm. I had a big crowbar, and I would pry these rocks out of the ground and brush them off. It had dirt and lots of moss on the sides of them, the ones that were half protruding from the ground. I'd brush them all off, and I made a huge heap of these rocks from my own land. And then I was going to cement them together. I thought I would use Saccrete, this pre-made cement stuff that you could buy by the sack. That way I wouldn't have to carry in sand. I had no cement mixer. I figured I would mix up my cement in a plastic bucket, which I had. And I had a trowel. I would mix it up with that. About the least effective way of doing it. And that's how I did it. I figured it would take me 5 sacks of this Saccrete stuff, because most of the bulk of my pillars was going to be taken up with rocks, right? Well, that's what I told myself. Didn't work out that way. After I'd used up 5 bags of Saccrete, I realized that I was barely begun. I ended up using something like 30 or 35 bags of this stuff. Again, the least cost-effective way of doing it. I should have had a cement mixer. I should have had sand and bags of cement and bags of gravel, maybe. But of course, everything I had to carry in. So it was a little simpler to carry in these bags of Saccrete, and they were heavy, these sacks. And I was out of shape. I'd been helping build this house down near Menominee. I'd been carrying cinder blocks around. I thought I was pretty tough, pretty good shape. But the first bag of Saccrete, I had to carry in this trail, 1/4 of a mile, somewhat uphill. I had to stop and rest a couple times, maybe 3 or 4 times my way in there. Put this sack down. It's very awkward carrying this thing. Heft it back up on my shoulder after a minute or two, stagger on up the hill. And by the time I was done carrying my 35 bags in, eventually, I was getting in shape. I'd sling one over my shoulder and walk straight up the hill and go back and get another one. So I was getting a little tougher. Not like a pioneer, not like people had been back in the 1800s when Granddad's family had moved to eastern Iowa. But tough for me, for a kid in the 1970s. And I gave up my idea of building a log cabin. That was ridiculous, I soon realized. To build a log cabin, you had to cut down your trees. You had to find straight trees, cut them down, let them dry out for a year or two. You had to strip them of their bark. You had to know what you were doing, which I didn't. Lumber, I understood to some degree. So there were lumber yards in Ironwood, which was 25 miles away. I could drive my red truck over to Ironwood. That's where I bought my Saccrete at the place that offered the best price. I did check around for prices. I wasn't totally inconsiderate of my budget. One way I maximized my possibilities was to load up the bed of the old truck as full as I could get it with all kinds of heavy stuff. And the ancient tires would bulge out. The cracks in the sides of them would strain, like in La Fontaine's fable of the little frog that wanted to blow himself up as big as a cow. Well, luckily enough, the tires on my old truck never exploded like that frog, but they might have come close. I had a little help every now and then. Some friends would come and visit for the weekend, and they would help me carry in supplies. And where it came to windows, I was very lucky, because it turned out they were tearing down an old school in Wakefield, junior high or high school, that had been built back in the boom times with the mining companies' profits when they'd had fancy buildings in Wakefield back in the teens and 20s of the 20th century. There'd been a couple of pretty fancy schools, and this school that was being torn down had a lot of beautiful windows. They were old, and the panes, glass is a liquid. it flows very slowly over time. So the windows were thicker at the bottom than they were at the top. I thought I could maybe reverse them and they could flow back down. Anyway, they were nicely distorting glass. When you'd look through them, there'd be this rippled effect of what you looked at off in the distance. And they had thick oak trim framing for the windows. They were heavy, but they were beautiful things. And eventually I planned my cabin to have 11 windows of these that I found at the school. They were mostly from over the doorways going into the classrooms. So they were large. They were maybe a yard wide and 2.5 feet high. I was going to double them up, so I used 22 of these things to have some weatherproofing from this bitter cold that was going to come with all this snow I would hear about. Tippy in his store, he told me about the snow that was coming. But my best friend for weather analysis was a man who sold the newspapers in Wakefield. He stood on the street, on the sidewalk, big, burly fellow, stood very upright. He was maybe 60 years old. He was a little simple in the head, very friendly, though, very friendly. Maybe he just had a simple outlook on life. But he sold these newspapers, very nice guy. Ed Clementola was his name. And I would approach Ed, I'd buy the Chicago Tribune from him, because that was the only big city newspaper he sold, so that I could keep up on the gas shortage and the Nixon administration. These sorts of things were going on in 1973. Whatever the latest crisis was, I'd read about it in this stalwart Republican newspaper from Chicago. But when I approached Ed Clementola every day, he would say, "Got your roof on yet?" I'd say, "No, Ed, any day now. I'll get it up soon. It's not going to snow yet." He'd look at the sky. He'd say, "Oh, it looks kind of gray. I think it's going to snow soon. You better get your roof up." And he was worried for me. I could tell. I didn't know if Tippy Novak was worried for me, because he knew I could sleep in the back of his store. I had that fallback. That was a standing offer by now, because I'd bought all sorts of stuff at his store. I was his best customer, probably. I wasn't going to be able to bathe in Lake Gogebic too much longer. Actually, I switched and I would swim in Lake Superior. It was cold in Lake Superior, even in August, even in early September. But I'd go swimming there, wash up. Then I'd go to a place called the Black River Restaurant. That was maybe a mile or two in from Lake Superior, and they had fresh herring dinners they offered. I'd have a few drinks and be all clean from swimming in the lake. It was just barely warm enough to swim in for about 3-4 minutes. Wash real fast, get out. I was like one of these Russian idiots who go jumping into the Volga or someplace, in February. And I was reaching the point where my 4 pillars for the cabin were just about ready. The cabin was going to be 13 feet square. I decided that. But it was on a slope, and one pillar was going to be way bigger than the others. It was about yay high off the ground and massive at the bottom. And it tapered up to hold the wall corner. And the shortest pillar was about 2 feet high. Those were going to be the dimensions, 13 feet square. I hadn't figured out exactly the design yet, and where each window was going to go, but I had some nice big doors from this school. And then I had to leave the area, because they were having a dinner for my father in Rockefeller Center in New York City. It was his retirement dinner. This was 1973, so Dad was 63 years old. He was retiring early from the council he had run for a number of years, part of the Rockefeller Foundation. He had an office there in Rockefeller Center. Couldn't have been a greater contrast, I was thinking, as I was making my way east, hitchhiking from Upper Michigan to New York City, and this fancy dinner that was going to be a surprise for Dad. My sister was setting it up, and some people in New York organizing it with her. Cliff Wharton, Dolores Wharton. John D. Rockefeller III was going to be there. He was the chairman of the board of Dad's organization. He would speak at the party. But then a funny thing happened. I went through my hometown of Ithaca on the way to New York City. I was hitchhiking, and I stopped off to see these friends, and they said, "Oh, have you heard the news? Your sister was in a terrible accident in Cooperstown. We just heard about this ourselves this morning. It wasn't a fire exactly, it was an explosion. And she and Mike, that was Ann's husband, were both terribly injured. You better go up there and see them. You hadn't heard about this?" No, I hadn't heard anything. I'd been on the road hitchhiking. So they lent me their spare car, and I drove over to Cooperstown, which was 3 hours away, 2 hours away. My parents were there. They had driven over from Ithaca. They were there in the room with Ann. Mike was in a separate room, and they were in hospital gowns with special little booties on and masks because infection was a great worry. Ann had been terribly burned and was not yet out of the woods in terms of infection. So I had to be dressed up in this outfit too. My parents didn't know I was coming. Ann didn't know I was in the area. When I walked in, I looked just like a doctor, they all said later. They thought I was some new consultant to come in to give them my expert opinion on burns. Well, I wasn't. I was the youngest family member. We were all concerned about Ann and Dad's retirement dinner, which she'd had to tell him about. It was supposed to be a surprise, but now he knew about it. That was in abeyance. It might take place or it might not. It was of no concern to us at the moment. So my parents and I stayed at the hospital, and Mike, my sister's husband, was a doctor at that same hospital. He was a surgeon, and his hands had been very badly burned in this explosion of a propane tank in this little mobile home they had been staying in because a house was being built for them. It was behind schedule, and the contractor felt bad, and he said, "Here, you can stay in my mobile home until your house is ready." So they were living there, and one of them had gotten up to start water for coffee in the morning, but the propane tank had been leaking for some time, and as soon as they lit the match to light the burner, the whole place exploded. It wasn't a fire, it was an instantaneous flame that filled up the whole place, and any part of them that was not covered with cotton material. And it turned out they were wearing cotton. She had on a nightgown, he had on cotton underwear and t-shirt. That saved any part that was covered with material, but any part that was exposed got terribly burned. Their faces, their hands, his legs. It's a dreadful thing. So my parents and I were at the hospital for several days. We weren't with Ann all the time. To pass the time, we'd talk about other things. I told Dad about the cabin I visualized, and he said, "Well, how would it look now?" And so on a napkin in the cafeteria of the hospital, I drew out an outline, how I saw it, 13 feet square, and how the roof was going to be like, it was going to be like a box for the downstairs and an A-frame set onto the box in shape. Not a loft above the bottom room, but a separate room upstairs, and I was going to connect it with one of these folding attic ladders so that I could fold it up out of the way when I was downstairs most of the time. But I would sleep upstairs, and I'd have a little room up there for writing my great novels. That was my idea. I was going to write these novels in the woods, in the wintertime, with this Upper Peninsula snow constantly falling outside. Maybe I'd have a kitten for company, which I did have eventually. So I told Dad about this, and then we'd go back when Ann was rested up, see her some more. She encouraged us to have this dinner for Dad in New York City, on schedule. She'd be all right. And that's the way it ended up. We did do that. John Rockefeller spoke. Cliff Wharton spoke. Cliff Wharton was Dad's longtime protege in the Agricultural Development Council. Wonderful man. He spoke. My brother Bill spoke. We looked out on the twinkling lights of the metropolis in the distance. We were on something like the 65th floor in the Rainbow Room or somewhere. What a contrast with a little tent in the woods, with Ed Clementola asking if I had my roof up yet. So when all of this celebrating was done, I headed back to the Midwest. I took a bus back, most of the way anyway. We had all gone back to Ithaca, Mom and Dad and I, and had spent several days together in our house there. And Dad would disappear into his study, where he thought his deep thoughts and would write these treatises on agricultural development. I figured that was what he was spending his time doing. When I was there, I'd be chatting with Mom out in the front room or going off doing things in Ithaca. But after 2 or 3 days, Dad emerged from his study, and he had 8 or 10 pages of instructions, all drawn out in pencil, longhand, with sketches, of how I could, if I decided to, proceed with my cabin in the woods. He held to the shape I had sketched on that napkin in Cooperstown. He said, "This is one way of doing it. I've been playing with this. If you'd like to, it's just advice. You don't have to do it this way. But it's a thought." He'd been spending all this time drawing out these step by step, and I hadn't given it any thought how I was going to put together this cabin. But he explained in his directions, well, you'd first build the equivalent of a tabletop. So you'd have a flat surface, because here I'm on this hillside. How am I going to build these sections? It's your work table, in effect, and for your roof trusses, you can nail down blocks and draw a template. Then if you put the lumber around it before you hammer it together, all the roof trusses will be identical. Your roof will lie flat. And so that's what I did. I got back to Michigan, got off the bus, went to the garage, got my truck, drove it back to my land, and I started banging these sections together once I got the framing material from the lumber yard. I still had a considerable amount of Granddad's $1,000 left. It wasn't going to be enough to finish the cabin, but I would learn some realities along the way. And I would deal with my shortfall when the time came. But I had the pillars done by then. Now it was time to frame up the roof trusses and the wall sections. Ed Clementola would say every day, "Got your roof up yet?" And I hadn't, but I was working on the sections. I'd tell him, "Well, Ed, I got roof trusses built, got my wall sections almost finished. Another week or so." By now we're in November, I think it was. I'd been very lucky. There had been no snow in October that year. He kept telling me how lucky I was. "But you can't stay lucky much longer. It always comes every year. It's snow, and it's heavy snow, and there's lots of it. Better get your roof on." So the time came, early or mid-November, had all the sections together, and I had called my friends in Minneapolis and at the farm outside Menominee, Bubbling Springs Farm. We all convened there in my woods. They brought other tents, arrived on a Friday evening, woke up to a cold rain that Saturday in November. And then we got to work. There were about a dozen of us, and we put these sections together. My friend Jim Bacon, who had fixed the brakes in my truck, he was skeptical, but he didn't say so. Later on, he said he was astonished that the whole thing fit together so perfectly, because it had just been these sections of walls and roof trusses that I'd leaned against trees there in the woods. And I said, "Well, of course it fit together. Dad made up the plans. I just followed them. And after we got the frame all put together there in the woods, and the roof was there, and we covered the roof with plywood, sheets of 1/4-inch plywood that I'd bought, freight damaged plywood, and then I doubled it up with another sheet of 1/4-inch plywood. It was quite cheap. And then put plastic over the whole thing. So it was covered, protected from this rain, wouldn't get soaked. We were exhausted. We'd worked hard all day on this, putting the sections together. And then we retired to a little place where I had started cleaning up when the weather had been too cold to go swimming in Lake Superior. I hadn't felt like going to Tippy's house to take shower. I couldn't do that exactly. I don't know why, but I didn't feel like doing that. I'd started going to Vince Orbick's Tumbleweed Ranch Bistro and Sauna. It was this fly-bitten, falling apart bar in Thomaston location, a little east and north of Wakefield. And Vince Orbick was this 80-year-old Polish guy who spat tobacco juice on the floor of his own bar and had a high giggle and a kind of funny way of talking. He'd rock back behind his bar and he would eye you. He called me Moses, and he would giggle and giggle. And he had a sauna out and back. I'd called it a sauna the first time I got there, but I was quickly redirected that the word for that was sauna. It was a Finn word. It was a Finn thing, and it was a sauna. 50 cents, sauna, out and back. Vince would come and fill up the wood stove in the sauna, and that's where I would clean up. Then I would go in and have a beer and a bump. "What you drinking?" says Vince. "Oh, I'll have a little brandy, Vince, if you don't mind." Well, anyway, the word was that Vince was a great cook. For 35 years, he'd been a butcher. He knew more about spare ribs than anyone in the area. And a Vince feast, an Orbick feast of spare ribs and sauerkraut, so I was told, was beyond compare. Now, either these old lumberjacks in the area were putting me on and trying to sucker me into a bad deal, or they were telling me the truth. I would know. Once we had this feast, he could feed all these 15 people who would be there. And it was the best spare ribs I've eaten in my life. The best sauerkraut. He explained how he'd made it. He'd had to rinse it this time and rinse it another time. He went through about 4 steps. It was so good. He had a great jukebox in the place with old Elvis and Ray Charles and Temptations songs on it. We drank brandy, drank beer, drank wine. We got drunk and we danced to the jukebox. People took saunas. And then finally, after this huge feast, it was time to go back and sleep in our tents near my cabin, which was nearly a cabin. It didn't have wood on the sides, but the frame was complete. The roof was up, I could tell Ed Clemente. And we toddled out. There were 6 inches of snow on the ground. The rain had turned to snow while we'd been inside feasting and drinking and dancing. The first snow of the year. And some of the people there visiting didn't feel like camping out that night. They could visualize their tents maybe sagging under this beautiful coat of new snow. It wasn't damp, wet snow either. It was beautiful, light snow. So several of them, and then a couple more, turned right around, walked back into Vince's bar and said, "Vince," because we were all on first name basis by then, "Vince, do you know of a motel around here where we could stay, possibly?" And Vince says, "Shit, you could stay right here. Got rooms upstairs. I'll go dust them off for you." Vince's place, everything was a challenge for a health inspector. There were no health inspectors at Vince Orbick's resort. He went upstairs, knocked down a few of the obvious cobwebs, maybe shook the sheets. I don't know. I didn't go with him. I didn't see any of this. I did go back to my big high tent that night. But a number of the people stayed at Vince's bar that night. And then Vince packed up all the leftover sauerkraut and spare ribs and put it in big coffee cans and sent us on our way with it to eat the next day. And I'd only paid him $30 for the whole shebang, the whole feast that more than fed a dozen people. And we had enough food left over to have a great big lunch the next day, spare ribs and sauerkraut. And then my friends dispersed. I was left on my own to finish the cabin, the sides, the floors, put in the windows. Ed Clementola was pleased that I had my roof up. I'd been very lucky. My grandfather's $1,000 was nearly gone, but now I could write to him and tell him what I'd done with it. With his financial help, and with the help of my father, his son, I built my cabin in the woods.